So to start off, what we're seeing here is I saw this image, it immediately clicked in my mind as something majorly important to my monarch symbolism video, as well as monarch mind control symbolism. But what we're looking at is a cross image of the human brain during a CT scan. And as we can see here directly in the center, what makes this image so significant and so symbolic is what we're seeing is literally the monarch mind control. We are literally seeing why it is called monarch mind control. And again, you don't understand this, go back and see my previous video called Symbols and Power, discussing the elements in the symbols and the anatomy, the physiology of monarch mind control. So what we're seeing here in the center, what actually makes up the body of the monarch within the human brain, is called the first and second ventricle, which is the hippocampus of the human brain. It's the optic thalamus region. And the hippocampus is what we call Amun's horn.
Just look at the alphabet from A to Z, from head to toe. If you line up the alphabet on the 26 letters from head to toe, it works that way too. In German, our word for toe is C, which is Z-E-H. You know, head to toe, the Z from A to Z, same thing. And if you line it up on the body, the alphabet, you get AB at the top, to MN in the middle, and that spells abdomen. Right, from ab to MN, abdomen.
That reminds me of the Ab being you know, the Ab being the father, and obviously the Ab being the father is also the head, or Aries, which is the Abba. It's the Abraham, the ram, you know, the ram of which is Aries, the head. So that's why the Ab, the A and the B would of course be at the head.
And that is what the first and second ventricle are. They make up the two wings of the monarch butterfly. And what would be the abdomen of the butterfly down below is what's called the third ventricle, which is also called a fornix, which means in etymology, the fornix means a vaulted chamber. And it's called a fornix, or a vaulted chamber, because as we can see, the geometry here makes up an archway, or a vault. It is the vault of heaven.
The vault of heaven corresponding to the human skull, and the third ventricle, or the fornix inside the brain, which is the vault of heaven, corresponding to ancient Egyptian cosmology. And again, I mentioned that the fornix is called the fornix because it means an archway. And here we're looking at the Freemasonic, the Royal Arch. And later on in the video, I will tie this in as to why it's royal. Because here in just a minute, I'm going to point out to you why the innermost chamber of the brain, if you overlay the Great Pyramid on top of the brain, the King's and Queen's chamber of the Great Pyramid corresponds exactly to the innermost chamber of the human skull, which is the thalamus, and the optic thalamus region where the pineal gland sits. So again, that's why it's called the King's Queen's chamber. And this is why it's located why it's the Royal Arch. And again, later on in the video, I'll explain more about why it's royal. and how it relates to the royalty, to the pharaoh, the king cobra, the king serpent, the basilisk, which means king serpent, which again refers to royalty. So I'll cover that in depth again later on throughout the video. But again, regarding this image that we're looking at right here, relating to the vault of heaven, the cranial vault, which, as I failed to mention in my last video, which is why this is a continuation of it, is the sphenoid bone. As I mentioned in the last video, is actually, it's the keystone of the human skull, meaning that in Masonry, the keystone of the arch is this stone right here, which is the key. That's the stone that holds the arch in place. It's what supports the entire structure, locks it all into place, holds it in support. And this is the finishing stone that is placed in the archway, and that's what gives it support. So in the human skull, the sphenoid bone is the keystone, and the sphenoid bone is what supports the most crucial glands, which would be the pituitary. And so again, that's why it supports the archway of the cranial vault. And again, what we're looking at here is this is the Royal Arch Freemasonry. You have the left and the right pillars, the twin pillars, as I'm about to mention here in just a second, which are the left and the right hemisphere, the sun and the moon. The left and right hemispheres, which also correspond to the first and second ventricle of the human brain, the twin pillars, the twin towers, the twin pillars of the sun and the moon. And what we're looking at here is the horizon. We're looking at the axis of the zodiac wheel. So this is Aries here, which is the first. It's the first, and Taurus, so then Taurus would be the last, as if you're completing the circle. So Aries is the first, it's springtime, it's the beginning, it's the alpha. And so, or if you, according to processional slippage, you know, the Taurus would be the alpha, depending on the age, the zodiacal age that you're in. But again, this is the first, and right over here, so this is where the sun rises in the east, at Aries. And then the sun sets over here at Libra. So this is where the sun hits the horizon and goes down into the underworld of the year, the winter months of the year. So the sun sets here, which is where it dies. And when we die, the heart is judged on this, weighed on the scales of judgment, which is, this is Libra. It's the scales, which weighs the heart at the death of the season, at the death of the sun, when it goes to the underworld, which again goes back to Egyptian cosmology. So that's what we're looking at here. And I mean, I could go through all of this, but that's not relevant to the video that I'm making. That's not relevant to the concept. Although here you have the cornucopia representing the abundance, but it's also, notice, it's the horn, as we were just referring to, Amun's horn, the hippocampus. And here you have the 7 stars, the Pleiades. So, but again, that's irrelevant to the video that I'm making. So, but also notice this later on. Notice the caduceus wrap up the pole. We're going to talk about that later on. The snake and the pole, the phallic pillar, and the serpent. So again, we'll cover that later on. But again, and also I forgot to mention this, the keystone is the sign of Cancer. Which, so again, this is where the sun rises. This is the sun at its peak at high noon. But in the season, it's the summer solstice, when the sun is at its peak, or the longest days of summer. So this is the height of the sun, and this is the death of the sun. Sunrise, sunset, when Set kills Horus, when Set overthrows Horus.
And the third ventricle is where the pineal gland is located, as well as the pituitary gland. And the pineal gland is obviously what we know as the third eye. So this third ventricle here is where we find the third eye, the third ventricle, the third eye, the vaulted chamber. And this is vaulted chamber, the fornix, is what we, if we place the image of the Great Pyramid directly over the human skull and line it up geometrically, this vaulted chamber, this third eye, this third ventricle, this fornix chamber directly corresponds to what's called the King's and Queen's chamber within the Great Pyramid of Egypt, of Giza. And so it's also what corresponds in biblical theology as Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber. And this monarch image here, the hypothalamus, the optic thalamus region, is also where the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, meaning an archway, as in the fornix, the vaulted chamber, the vault of heaven. The two wings of this monarch, the two wings correspond to the two cherubim, which guard the Ark of the Covenant, which are two sphinxes, whose wings are touching. And the etymology of the word fornix comes from fornis, which means furnace. And in this case, we're referring to where the eternal flame burns, the light of the mind, the pineal gland, the light of human consciousness, which is a photoreceptor. And again, go back to see my series called Symbols of Power to discuss the essence of light and the pineal gland being a photoreceptor. In other words, a receiver of light, which controls the human circadian rhythms, the regulation of sleep and consciousness. So inside the fornix, or the furnace, where the eternal flame burns, in Freemasonry it's known as the eternal flame. Just like the Olympic torch is lit and is kept burning throughout the entire games, which represents the eternal flame, the torch carried through the underworld of mythology, which is the light of consciousness. It's the light that is never extinguished. The light of consciousness, the enlightenment, the light of the mind. Enlightenment means light within the mind.
Yeah, it's like the the candle is the sacred flame. It's the keeping of the sacred flame.
The spirit.
The spirit. Which is why, in like the Olympics, you have to keep, and in Masonry they keep the torch lit, they keep the flame, the sacred fire burning, and obviously that's the spirit. It's the spirit it's the flame, it's the spark of life.
It's the burning light. It's the flame.
It's as David Bowie's Black Star song refers to as the solitary candle.
The mind's eye, the third eye, lies directly in the center of the human skull. The pineal is sensitive to light and generates its own source of perceptual light as dimethyltryptamine. It's known as the seat of the soul and the receptor of consciousness. It is the receiver of sight beyond sight.
The eye of thundeRA, a thundercat's in danger.
The wavelength beyond the visible light spectrum of far infrared to ultraviolet. Your spiritual eyes, the eyes that you use to see when dreaming, the eyes that see in the dark when you sleep. The solitary candle that burns throughout the night. It is said, if thine eye be single, the whole body shall be full of light.
And notice how it's called the Villa of Ormond, which, when he says it in his English accent, sounds exactly similar to the Villa of Amen, which, as I've covered in one of my previous articles, the Villa of Amen of the human skull, the foramen being a hole where the nerves pass through. So it's the chamber of Amen, the solitary candle, the eternal flame, the light within the mind, the torch that bears through the underworld, the torch that is lit to carry through the underworld, to guide the passage through the underworld, to guide the way through death and into rebirth and eternal life. And the word fornix is where we get the word fornication, because a fornix was also referred to as a vaulted chamber. In other words, it was linked and related etymologically to a brothel, or in other words, a place where you go for fornication. But in ancient times, which was known as sacred sexuality or sacred prostitution. So this vault, this arched chamber, this arch of heaven is also where we, linked to Freemasonry, is where we get the arch. And at the direct center of that arch, the most crucial component of the arch is the key, what's known as the keystone. And this next image that we'll take a look at is created to illustrate that the pons, which connects to the optic thalamus in the human brain, identically corresponds to the ancient hieroglyphic depictions of the deity called Ptah, or Ta, if you use the silent P, Pitta, which was phonetically pronounced Pitta, and I'll portray how it's more than just iconography and images or images that connect Ptah as the ophthalmos. In Egyptian mythology, Ptah, vocalized again as Pitta in ancient Egyptian, is the demiurge of Memphis, the god of creation, the arts, fertility, and craftsmanship. He is considered the demiurge who existed before all other things, and by his willfulness thought the world into existence. It was first conceived by thought and realized by the word. Pitta conceives the world by thought of his heart and gives life through the magic of his word. That which Pitta commanded was created, with which the constituents of nature, fauna, and flora are contained. A document known as the Memphite Theology shows the god Pitta responsible for creation of the universe by thought and by the word. And it's funny how this directly links to the Genesis creation story, long predating the Genesis creation story. The demiurge is from Latinized Greek demiurgos, literally public or skilled worker, the deity of craftsmanship, artisan. Demiurgos comes from demos, meaning common people. See demotic plus orgos, meaning the root word ergos, meaning work, which is linked to the etymology of the word organ. So the pineal gland and the pituitary gland are both organs, which does work. Hence the word ergos, as in demiurgos, or a small organ, which does work. So the pituitary gland is also linked to pitta, pituitary, pitta, a small organ which does work. This is an excerpt from Antoine Gigol's Crown and the Hero of the Sea. All this is leading us to the rudimentary eye in the human brain. The pitta linked to the word ophthalmos. Ophthalmos is ancient Greek meaning eye, as in the all-seeing eye, the pineal gland. The pitta that Iamblichus is writing about in his book De Mysteris Egyptorium, as the creative intellect, the Lord of the truth and knowledge, the pitta who will become pitta. All the past and all the secrets are in the words and the sounds, a long journey from the origins for the most sacred artifact of Egypt. The word ophthalmos, secularly described as being from the root words ops, meaning eye, see optic, a form related to thalamus, meaning inner room or chamber, or in other words, the third ventricle, the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies. So ophthalmos, meaning eye, is a compound word composing of eye and thalamus, meaning inner room chamber of the inner eye. And I've gotten into arguments with Stephen Bankhurst of Spirit Science and Metaphysics website over all this theology and the etymology. He claims that ophthalmos can't possibly be talking about the pineal gland, can't possibly be referring to the third eye, and it simply is used in the context regarding the external eyes. But that is not true at all, and I will prove that through the etymology. See, again, they say that it comes from the word ops, meaning eye, plus thalamus. They would have you believe that ophthalmos is a compound word of ops plus thalamus, but that's not the case at all. The prefix of the word-forming element ophi OPHI, however, refers to a serpent or snake. So look at the word again. It's ophthalmos, not ophthalmos. From the point of view of biological evolution, the pineal gland represents a kind of atrophied photoreceptor, which means a receiver of light. In the epithalamus of some species of amphibians and reptiles, such as snakes, it's linked to a vestigial organ known as the parietal eye. A parietal eye, also known as a third eye or pineal eye, is photoreceptive, meaning receptive to light. It's a receiver of light, and it's sensitive to light, and it emits its own light, and is associated with the pineal gland, regulating circadian rhythmicity, sleep and wake cycle, and hormone production for thermal regulation, body temperature regulation. The very fact that thalamus alone means inner chamber is a dead giveaway that it's referring to the third eye, the Holy of Holies, as it corresponds to Solomon's temple, the third ventricle of the human brain, which is direct midline between the left and right ventricles, or the twin, which are known as the twin pillars. So it's the third pillar of Freemasonry, which stands directly between the two pillars of the sun and the moon, the left and the right hemispheres, the left and the right ventricle, the twin pillars, of which the third pillar stands directly in the center, hence the third eye and the third ventricle. So refer to this amulet of King Tutankhamun's tomb, the amulet of the Uraeus serpent, where the Uraeus symbol was made to represent the goddess Wadjet, which was the ancient Egyptian serpent goddess. It was a serpent deity. And what this amulet is depicting with the Uraeus is it's depicting snake eyes.
Snakes have sight beyond sight because they can see in the infrared spectrum. So in other words, they have heat vision. They can sense infrared heat. So they have thermal vision. So they can see beyond the typical spectrum of visible light that humans can see. So they have the sight beyond sight. And they sense this heat around them by taking in, they smell through their tongue, but they also send information into the heat-sensing membranes, which allows them to have the thermal vision. And these two cones, or these cones of vision, overlap directly at the center, leaving a perfectly visible Vesica Piscis geometry visual pattern.
The eye of the snake, the third eye, the all-seeing eye, the parietal eye, a vestigial remnant of the reptilian anatomy, the reptilian physiology, which the human brain is segmented into three main segments. You have the pons, or in other words, the brain stem, which regards to survival and direct basic needs, and then you have the midbrain, which relates to emotions, and which is the mammalian brain, which relates to emotions and temperature regulation and hormone production. And then you have the newest development of the brain, which is the neocortex, which is related to higher thinking and higher cognitive abilities, rational functioning, problem solving. So the reptilian portion of the brain is referring to the most basic urges of human nature, which is survival, and the basic needs of human survival. Again, the inner eye, the third eye, as everyone knows by now, the pineal gland, is regulated by the Kundalini serpent energy of the body's central nervous ganglia. In other words, gangs or networks of glial cells, of glia, which are neural cells, which represents enlightenment, or in other words, light within the mind. The serpent energy represents life, rebirth, fertility, divinity, and royalty, as shown by the basilisk, which means king serpent, which comes from the root word of basil, which means king or royalty, basil or basil, king or royalty, which is exactly why the king pharaohs wore the uraeus cobra, or in other words, the king cobra on the third eye, which just so happens that the pons, the brainstem, and the thalamus portion of the inner brain is known as the reptilian complex, which corresponds to the very base of animal functioning, the basic animal nature, or in other words, the base, which means the very base of the human brain, the bottommost segment of the human brain, which relates directly to survival and instinct, which is why it's called the basal ganglia, or the basal ganglia. Literally means the base of the brain. It's the most basic ganglia of the human brain, which is why the base of the brain, or the basal ganglia, looks exactly like a hooded cobra standing on its tail, standing erect. Exactly like the uraeus cobra on the pharaoh's third eye, stands erect, which is a direct representation of the pons. It's a direct representation of the reptilian complex of the human brain. It's a direct representation of royalty, of the king's chamber, of the third ventricle, the serpent, the snake eye. The pineal gland is the only midline brain structure that is unpaired or azygous. It's not directly bisymmetrical, and it takes its name from its pine cone shape, which follows a perfect golden ratio Fibonacci hypertrochoid pattern. Which is the fundamental basis of magnetism and every form of function in this universe. Stedman's medical dictionary describes the innermost layer of the brain as tender mother. The innermost layer, the pia mater, which is Latin, again, tender mother, is a thin, delicate membrane that inspired some early neuroanatomists with a poetical bent to compare the way this membrane envelops the brain to the gentleness of a mother caressing her infant. Note again, the medical dictionary refers to this inner part of the brain as a mother caressing her infant. Does this begin to make sense to you as to who the Virgin Mother is? The outermost layer of the brain matter is called the dura mater, meaning tough mother, and the inner layer, the pia mater, the tender mother, between the two lies a reticulated layer of tissue called the arachnoid, whose appearance reminded one of a spider's web. Arachnoid, the web, the curtain, the veil. It's in the brain separating the outer from the inner, just as the temple veil separates the inner from the outer. Arachnoid literally in Latin means old spider mother. The Native Americans have legends of Spider Grandmother, who is the creator of heaven, who wove the web of the stars.
Just as in our neuroanatomy we have the web woven of neural connections, just as in the universe we have the web of neural connections within the mind of the universe.
The human physiology and the knowledge of all the universe is evil. You keep them away from it through fear. You tell them to fear it at all costs. Therefore, they will never awaken. They will never have knowledge.